All right, so welcome back. This will be the second main video in the series of professional development lectures on publishing and presenting your research in academic journals and at conferences. This discussion is focused on manuscript preparation, so the actual research that we write up that we then submit for publication. Let me open this up. And just to put this in the broader context of the series of discussions, first we talked about why we might want to publish and present our work in academic conferences or publish our work in academic journals or other venues like professional newsletters. This discussion is going to focus on, it's a little bit longer than the last one and probably some of the others. It's got three parts actually we're going to cover all in this one video. We're going to talk about choosing a topic, lots of different considerations there that you may already be working on something, but if you're not working on something you want to get involved in publishing, of course you have to choose a topic that's going to be good for you and good for also the publication value and likely to be published. Secondly, we want to talk about how to actually write up that work. That's whether you're working on something or not, how you can write it up in a way that makes it likely to be accepted for publication. And then third, once you have a written manuscript, you want to make sure you choose the right venue and the right journal. And that's actually something that doesn't necessarily happen at the end. It might actually occur earlier on in the process, but we're going to talk about that third in today's discussion. And then after this, we're talking about the journal submission process. Once you already have that complete manuscript, when you go ahead and submit in that process, which has a lot of different steps to it. Additional suggestions for publishing in video 4, and then 2 additional discussions on conferences, one on getting your work into conferences, and then again another on presenting your work at conferences in the most effective way. So moving forward there, first of the 3 topics in this discussion, choosing a topic that you're going to write about for publication. And there are a lot of different ways you can do this. A lot of different things that you might, if you're working on something already, because this is not so much of an issue, but if you're trying to decide what you might want to do research on and what you might want to publish on, different considerations. So one of them would be, I like to see as an editor, as a reviewer, I like to see some kind of theoretical relevance. Not all fields or all research needs to be heavy on theory, but if it is a domain that you're working within that has relevant theory, I want to see that you're connecting your work to the theory. And so you might think about what's been done before, what sort of ideas have been put out, and how you might connect to those. So I like to see some sort of theoretical relevance. And thinking about a topic, a lot of times great ideas for research and for publication can also come from personal relevance, from your own experience as an instructor, as a professional, as a student, as a learner, educator. So think about that as well. And the personal relevance may or may not figure prominently in the actual manuscript, but in some types of publications that's more and less appropriate, but it certainly might be a source of ideas for what you want to write about, what you want to start researching and conduct, whether that's a study or a position paper or something like that, or something more like write for a newsletter as well. And then a third consideration might be practical relevance. This is going to be the case for a lot of us, that we want to produce research and produce articles or publications of different types that has some kind of relevance to the real world, to practice and policy or assessment. In my case, in the field of second language education, most often that has to do with language instruction or pedagogy or language assessment, language policy, things like that. In choosing a topic, a lot of times people, in making a case for the paper that they're writing, they often describe and they identify the gap in the literature, and that's great. But I want to emphasize that I don't think that simply the fact that nobody's done something before, or the fact that nobody's talked about a particular topic, or even that not a lot of people have talked about a particular topic, that alone isn't enough. There has to be some kind of personal and or theoretical and or practical relevance to the topic. It's not simply enough that it hasn't been done before. And I'll also suggest that as a kind of a preliminary idea in terms of choosing a topic, that if you're still not sure, if nothing really jumps out to you from your own professional practice, or other things experiences you've had, other readings, to dig into the ends of studies. There's so much rich information. If you just read any articles or studies or position papers or whatever, but that are interesting to you, and then especially at the ends of the empirical studies. Oftentimes researchers, almost always, will talk about the limitations of their own research. And there's a few different reasons they do this. One is to sort of give caveats and explain the limits of the limits of the scope of the findings, to say what sort of and also talk about what weaknesses might have been present in their design or their analysis or their findings, and talk about the extent to which their findings might be generalized to other populations or contexts or learners or whatever the focus is. But oftentimes, when I read those, I always read limitation sections as if they were suggestions for future research. And sometimes they are. Good authors will actually frame their limitation sections in that way, to talk about limitations of their studies, and then immediately talk about, after that, what can be done or what future researchers needed to build on or to improve on the study that they're talking about. And so another great way to discover or choose a topic is to look at what's been done before, look at the limitations, and also the suggestions for future research, and see if you can pick up on any of those loose ends for your own work. I'll also say, as another great way to get involved in publication and doing research, is to consider replicating a study that you find interesting. A lot of people, I think there's some myths out there about replication research. For some people, they feel that there's two sort of main impediments for a lot of people in getting involved in replication research. One of them is the interest in novelty. And a lot of people feel that replication research, because it's inherently not something brand new, it's not a new idea, it's something by nature that's been done before, that's less interesting. And I want to push back on that idea. And a lot of folks know that across the social and educational sciences, behavioral sciences, and lots of other fields as well, are also pushing back on this idea that novelty is so important. Of course, we need new ideas to advance a field, but we also need to understand the validity of findings that have been observed before. And so we want to know not only the validity, the internal validity, or how well we can trust the findings of a particular study, but also the external validity or the generalizability. And that's one of the great things we get from replication research, is it helps us have greater confidence in the results that we already have. It also gives us an indication of the external validity of those results to other contexts, other learners, other participants, in the case of second language research, other target structures perhaps. And so it helps us to know how far the results of one particular study can be extended, how far they reach, and how much they might apply in other contexts with other learners or populations. So really, for me, it's really all about generalizability. Like I mentioned, there's been a lot of momentum here, and there was a large-scale project replication study carried out in psychology. 100 sort of prominent studies were replicated. And you have here a scatter plot, essentially, of the relationship between the original effect sizes and the replication effect sizes. In other words, the strength of the relationship or the effects that were observed in the studies. And we see that a lot of the studies the replication studies didn't find the same results as was found in the original studies. And that's just an indication that there may be something going on, that maybe people either aren't reporting their full results, or maybe a lot of these effects or relationships or findings that we thought of as really solid maybe are worth questioning, or at least toning down a little bit in terms of the strength of the findings or the relationships that we're looking at. So something to consider. Again, replication research isn't about disproving other people's research. That's not the point. We're not trying to falsify people's findings. We're just trying to actually arrive at a better understanding of the relationships in question. And I, for example, as a researcher, if anybody wants to replicate my research, I find it great and I welcome it. It's not like I feel threatened, and most researchers won't feel threatened. I'd be more than happy, maybe even honored, if somebody was to say, hey, I thought your study was important enough that it merits a replication. So I encourage folks to consider that as well. In terms of sort of a second topic, beyond choosing a topic, now on to how to write work that'll get accepted. So you choose a topic, and then of course you want to produce studies or manuscripts or whatever you're working on in a way that will be likely to be accepted in the venue where you want to submit it, in your target venue, be that a journal or a professional newsletter or whatever it is. And most of the time I'm talking about actual empirical studies. First, I want to say, right, early and often, and starting in graduate school, I know that some of you may be still in graduate school. Some of you, of course, are beyond that. Faculty members, of course, beyond graduate school, thankfully. But starting even in graduate school, and we can work with our graduate students on this, people should always have publication in mind. It's not simply, course papers, sort of for me or for starting in graduate school are really a thing of the past. They were always looking to somehow contribute back to the academic community. And I actually believe that in many cases it's unethical not to view it that way. If we're producing good research, whether it be synthesis of research or position papers or theoretical papers, ideas, empirical studies, whatever it is that we're producing, that it's our duty to contribute back to our academic communities through publication. And that's the way we do that. I'll also say that in terms of how to produce work, it doesn't have to be linear. So this is just my process. And everybody's process is different, but my process generally looks like, first I put together kind of a skeleton, it's kind of messy lit review with some methods for when I'm doing a study. And then later I revise the methods, I analyze the data, I produce the results. And then as I'm producing the results, I usually make notes, extensive notes on for what I want to talk about in the discussion section. And then when the third step is when I sort of simultaneously work on the lit review and the discussion, because those two sections are really, really closely connected in an empirical study, right? We want to, in the discussion section, interpret the results, but not just interpreting the results as they are, interpreting the results in relation to the same topics and studies and ideas, theoretical, practical issues that we raised in the literature review. So we raise all these issues, we point out the gaps in the empirical literature, the tensions or the controversies in the literature review, and then you want to loop back to those in the discussion to make sure that you tie up those loose ends. And then interpret or maybe even reinterpret some of the findings from the studies in the literature review in the discussion in light of the work from your own study. I'll also say about the discussion section, I find this generally to be the weakest section. Oftentimes I see just summary, and we're looking for more. We're looking for interpretation. We're looking for results and what they say about relevant theory or practical issues. Like I said, I like to make notes for the discussion while I write up the results. Also, though, I think it's important to take your time with the discussion section. Let the findings kind of settle, let the dust settle a little bit, let it soak in a little bit before just writing out all the discussion, and sort of really reconsider. Maybe even that might involve going back to rereading previous studies and thinking about how your findings fit in that broader existing body of literature and what your study has to add to that existing body of literature. Other suggestions for how to write work that will be accepted. I'm a big proponent of transparency, and there's and that's sort of a broad, almost like philosophical concept in terms of publication and writing and being a researcher. But for me, transparency means a few different things. And one way that we can be transparent is by sharing our data collection instruments. And that way, the couple benefits there. One, it facilitates replication. If future researchers want to work with want to do something similar, they have your instruments available. But two, and maybe even a more immediate and maybe more compelling reason to share your instruments, to make them available either within the manuscript itself or on a repository. I put there the IRIS database, which is specific to second language research. But maybe a more compelling reason to make them available there or elsewhere is simply that people can evaluate the work more themselves, and they can get a clear idea of where your data came from, and therefore interpret the validity of the findings of the study. To take transparency a step further, you can actually even share your data, and this is something that not everybody is comfortable doing, but and there are restrictions and limitations as far as ethics and IRB and everything. But that's something that we can do. This is actually partly the results from a study I did with a couple of colleagues, where we were actually looking at reanalyzing real raw primary data using a new statistical procedure that somebody had proposed, a procedure called bootstrapping. And so we did, rather than simulating data or fabricating data, we asked 200 some authors of studies in our field if they would share their raw data with us for the purpose of reanalysis. And in the end, we got no response from about 2/3 of the participants. And in the end, we only got 10% of the people that we asked data from actually provided their data and enabled us to reanalyze it. So, but I think that's actually changing a little bit. I think people are becoming more comfortable with sharing their data. Maybe more generally, though, I'd encourage folks to think and act collaboratively, not just individually. So to think about being more open and sharing materials and sharing ideas and data with other researchers out there who are working on similar things. Again, it's not, I think some people feel a little bit threatened by that, but I think if we think of ourselves as more of a community of researchers and sort of the idea that we're all in this together, that might help reduce the feeling that it's sort of competition among researchers. I think that's not a healthy way for us to act. The broader, building further on this idea of transparency, this is sort of a movement that's been taking place across the social sciences. Like I mentioned, we can make our data available. Part of this movement involves also better reporting of data. So really important that we report full descriptive statistics for quantitative studies and other important descriptive and inferential statistics, effect sizes, confidence intervals, power. And I'm happy to talk more about those if people are interested in a little bit more in terms of use of statistics in their research. A number of applied linguistics journals now require effect sizes, including Calico Journal, Foreign Language Journals, Language Learning and Technology, and a bunch of other studies journals there. Also part of transparency, another option that authors have available to them now is to pre-register a study. There's actually a badge system that lots of journals have been taking up lately. And what this does is it sort of recognizes that authors of studies have taken certain steps to be more transparent with the academic community. So this is actually a mini screenshot from a paper of mine that was just published. And this has this little badge here indicating that our data collection instrument from that study is available publicly and freely accessible. Another point along these lines of writing work that will be accepted is I would highly recommend everybody to think about, and maybe don't make a final decision, but think about what might be your target outlet before you finish writing. It's something that, because you're going to craft the discussion in a different way depending on where you plan to submit the manuscript. Okay, so in terms of doing that, in terms of choosing our venue, well, we have lots of different choices, right? The traditional choice, article in a peer-reviewed journal, other choice, and this is just a comic, right? Popular science bestseller, engrave findings on the wall of a secret chamber, beam it out to space. Anyway, lots of different options that we have. Traditionally, and most of the time, what I'm thinking of here in this discussion is talking about submitting to academic journals, but there might also be a professional newsletter that might also be relevant for your research. So one major consideration is to make sure that if you're submitting to a journal, that it's a reputable journal. There are a lot of predatory, for-profit journals out there that look and sound in a lot of ways like real academic journals. So one thing to look for in trying to know if you're not quite sure whether a particular outlet is legitimate and reputable, one way to figure that out, and this won't always indicate whether a journal is legitimate or not, but if it is published by a major press, such as Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, Wiley, Elsevier, Routledge, Taylor and Francis, Benjamins, Sage, Springer, these are major outlets. And if a journal is published by one of these outlets, it's a legitimate journal. You can also look at the editorial board and actual editors of the journal. If they're recognized scholars in your field, then you know that it's probably to be trusted. And then third, that there shouldn't be any fees associated with it. Now, a big caveat to that is that there are some journals that will require fees in order to obtain open access. And that's actually a really great thing. It's sort of a new movement in terms of making more research available to a wider audience. But some journals are actually for profit. The ones that, there's a difference between fees to publish in order to make an article open access and fees simply to publish because the journal is a for-profit journal. And so generally it shouldn't have fees. One exception, one very notable exception is the journal Plus One, which is a journal that's relevant to lots and lots of different fields. They have lots of different sections, and I think it stands for the Public Library of Science. And that's one journal that does have publication fees, but that it's in the name of open access, because they don't. There's no subscription, no library subscription required. It's open to everybody. It is actually a very prestigious journal, but it also has fees associated with it. So that's one distinction to make. So red flags in terms of identifying journals that would be predatory or not legitimate. If you're receiving form letter solicitations, I get these all the time. If they're sort of generic solicitations to submit, probably not a good sign. Most reputable and respected prestigious journals don't go soliciting journals in article submissions in a blanket sort of way, in a non-discriminate way. They may solicit articles from experts, and that's perfectly legitimate and great, but they won't just send them out blindly as a form letter. If a journal offers acceptance without peer review, that's also not a good sign. You want to see peer review. And then again, if there are fees associated with publication in a particular journal, that's also a red flag. So other considerations in terms of choosing the right journal venue for your work. A great place to, and this often a way that I decide where I'm going to submit to, is where are the papers published that you're citing in the paper. So if you look at the papers that you're citing in the literature review, where were those published? And that would probably be a good indicator of an appropriate place to submit your paper. Along with that, though, you also want to check out the stated scope and the mission of the journal to see what they talk about. And you have to know that certain different journals, they may have very similar names. And I'll just give you examples from my own field right here. Second language research that sound very similar, but that actually have important distinctions between them. And so, for example, studies in second language acquisition. This journal, of course, publishes lots of empirical studies, but it also does accept what are called squibs, or sort of short position type papers. Explicitly accepts replications, short reports of empirical studies. Foreign language annals, by contrast, does not accept position papers, and papers must be practice oriented. Second language research, by contrast to foreign language annals, doesn't accept anything practical or pedagogically oriented. It only wants papers with theoretical relevance. Another journal similar to the others, but distinct, language teaching, in that it doesn't accept regular studies, empirical studies. It really almost exclusively only accepts invited review papers. So in that case, even if you were citing a lot of papers in language teaching, if you were carrying out an empirical study, you probably wouldn't submit directly to that journal. So it's just important that you know the culture or the sort of identity and the history of the journal that you're publishing or that you're submitting to. Another way to look at that, and these are some data from a couple studies of mine looking at publication patterns in different journals in my own field. So in second language research, there's always a target language, a language that's being studied in the research, and so we see that certain journals lean more heavily towards English as a target language. This journal, Language Teaching Research, very heavily oriented towards English as a target language, versus second language research, much less, about half the percentage of studies published in the journal Second Language Research have English as a target language. And then in terms of lab versus classroom-based studies of second language research, this journal here, Second Language Research, almost all the studies are lab-based. Language Teaching Research, by contrast, very few are lab-based. They're almost always classroom-based. So again, if you're carrying out a classroom-based study, probably going to be a better fit for LTR, Language Teaching Research, than for second language research. And then finally, I'll say aim high. I always like to, try and be realistic about where I'm going to submit a paper, but I like to aim high to a higher tier journal first. If it doesn't get accepted there, that's okay. But yeah, at least I tried there. Being realistic, and then maybe I lower my expectation for where I might submit the next round. Okay, so after preparing the manuscript, the next step is going to be the journal submission process, the long, sometimes grueling, and maybe unnecessarily mysterious journal submission process. And we'll talk about that in the next video. So I will stop on this one, and I'll see you in the next one.